The sound of a gunshot echoed through the small homestead as Josephine Miller stumbled backward, her hand flying to her chest in shock. Not from a bullet, but from the words her husband had just spat in her face. "I never loved you and I'm taking everything," he declared, shoving papers into his saddlebags. It was 1875 in the Montana Territory, and at 24 years old, Josephine found herself watching her life crumble before her very eyes. "Thomas, please," she begged, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged cheeks. 3 years of marriage must mean something to you." Thomas Miller barely glanced at her as he mounted his horse, the deed to their land and all their savings tucked safely in his pocket. "It means I wasted 3 years. That gold rush in Dakota Territory won't wait, and neither will that widow in Billings who's been warming my bed." Josephine gasped, her knees giving way as she collapsed onto the hard, packed dirt of their yard. Their yard, no, not anymore. According to what he'd just told her, he'd gambled away their homestead to a man named Fletcher, who'd be coming to claim it within the week. "You can't leave me with nothing," she whispered. But Thomas was already spurring his horse, dust billowing in his wake as he rode away without a backward glance. For 3 days, Josephine barely moved from the small cabin she'd helped build with her own hands. She'd come west with Thomas full of dreams, leaving behind her family in Boston after her parents died of influenza. They were supposed to build a life together, raise children on this beautiful stretch of Montana wilderness. Now all she had was the dress on her back, and whatever food remained in the pantry. On the 4th morning, as Josephine was contemplating which possessions she might be able to carry if she walked to the nearest town a daunting 15 miles away, she heard the approach of hoofbeats. Her stomach twisted with dread. This must be Fletcher, come to claim his property. She scrambled to her feet, hastily wiping tears from her face and pinning up her auburn hair that had hung loose and unwashed for days. If she had to beg for a few more days' shelter, she would maintain what little dignity she had left. The rider who appeared around the bend of the trail was not what she expected. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. His face was partially shadowed by a worn Stetson, but she could see a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. He pulled his horse to a stop when he saw her standing on the porch. "Madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair and piercing blue eyes that took in her situation with one sweeping glance. "I'm looking for Thomas Miller." "He's gone," Josephine replied, her voice scratchy from days of crying. "If you're Mr. Fletcher, the property is yours." "I'll be gone by sundown." The man's brow furrowed as he dismounted. "Name's Kyle Prescott, madam, not Fletcher, and what do you mean the property is mine?" Josephine felt a flash of confusion. "You're not here to claim the homestead." "My husband gambled it away to a man named Fletcher before abandoning me 3 days ago." Kyle Prescott's expression darkened as he approached the porch, keeping a respectful distance. "No, madam, I'm the foreman from the Rocking P Ranch to the north. Your husband borrowed money from my boss 6 months back, promised to repay it with interest. I've come to collect." A bitter laugh escaped Josephine's lips. "Well, Mr. Prescott, you're too late. Thomas took every cent we had along with the deed to this place. He's headed for the Dakota Territory gold fields." She gestured helplessly around her. "As you can see, there's nothing left to collect." Kyle studied her for a long moment, taking in her bedraggled appearance and the desperation in her eyes. "You're his wife." "Josephine Miller," she confirmed, then added bitterly, though apparently that didn't mean much to him. Kyle removed his gloves, tucking them into his belt as he thought. "When is Fletcher coming?" "Within the week," Thomas said, "though I have no way of knowing for certain." Kyle glanced at the small cabin, the struggling vegetable garden, and the empty corral where their horses had once stood. Thomas had taken those too, selling all but his own mount for gambling money over the past months. "Mrs. Miller, have you eaten today?" The question caught her off guard. "Aye." No, without another word, Kyle returned to his horse and retrieved a small bundle from his saddlebag. I've got jerky and hardtack, not much, but it'll keep your strength up while we figure this out. We, Josephine echoed, bewildered by this stranger's concern. Kyle nodded. My boss won't be happy about the money, but he's a fair man. He wouldn't see a woman left homeless because of her no-good husband. He hesitated, then added, If you'll permit me, I'd like to help. Something in his steady gaze made Josephine believe him. For the first time in days, a flicker of hope warmed her chest. She stepped aside, gesturing toward the cabin door. I can offer coffee, at least. It's all I have to give in return. That would be mighty welcome, Mrs. Miller, Kyle said, following her inside. And then we'll talk about what comes next. What came next was not at all what Josephine expected. Kyle stayed until sunset, helping her take inventory of what little remained and listening to her story. Thomas had been gambling for months, she explained, disappearing for days only to return with grand tales of business ventures. She'd been blind to it, wanting to believe in the man she'd married. I was a fool, she admitted as they sat on the porch, watching the Montana sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. No, Kyle said firmly, you were loyal. There's no shame in that. When darkness fell, Kyle politely asked if he might sleep in the barn, as it was too late to return to the rocking P. Josephine agreed, grateful not to be alone with her fears for one more night. The next morning, Kyle was up before dawn, and Josephine found him mending the broken porch step. Mr. Prescott, you needn't do that, she protested. He looked up, hammer in hand. Place needs fixing if you're to stay here. But I'm not staying. Fletcher, I've been thinking about that, Kyle interrupted, setting down his tools. What if Fletcher never finds out Thomas gambled away the property? Josephine frowned. I don't understand. The way I see it, there's no record of that poker game at the land office yet. If Fletcher shows up, it'll be your word against his. But Thomas signed something, a piece of paper with no witnesses isn't legally binding, Kyle explained. And if Thomas is headed for Dakota, he won't be coming back to confirm Fletcher's claim. Hope rose in Josephine's chest, only to be crushed by reality. Even if that worked, I can't run this place alone. The crops need tending, winter's coming, and I have no money for supplies. Her voice caught. I don't even have a horse. Kyle was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. Mrs. Miller, I have a proposition for you. It's not conventional, and you have every right to refuse. Josephine tensed. She'd heard stories of women in desperate situations being offered arrangements that compromised their virtue. Seeming to sense her wariness, Kyle quickly continued. I own a small homestead about 10 miles east of here. It's not much, just a cabin and 30 acres, but it's mine free and clear. I rarely use it, being at the Rocking P most times. What are you suggesting, Mr. Prescott? Kyle met her gaze directly. A marriage of convenience, Mrs. Miller. You'd have my name, legal protection, and a place to live. Fletcher couldn't touch you as a married woman with property of your own. Josephine stared at him, speechless. But why would you do such a thing for a stranger? Kyle's eyes softened. My sister found herself in a similar situation years back. No one helped her. He looked away, his jaw tightening at the memory. I swore I'd never stand by and watch another woman suffer the same fate if I could prevent it. And what would you expect in return? Josephine asked cautiously. Nothing improper, he assured her quickly. The arrangement would be in name only, for as long as you need protection. You'd have my name, my property, and my respect, nothing more and less. He trailed off, a slight flush coloring his tan cheeks. Unless someday you wanted something more, he finished quietly. But that would be entirely your choice, Mrs. Miller. Josephine's mind raced. The offer was extraordinary, almost unbelievable. You'd marry a woman you've just met, expect nothing in return, and give her your property? I'm offering you a fresh start, Kyle corrected, and it wouldn't be entirely selfless. I've been looking for someone to care for the place, make it a proper home. The cabin's been sitting empty too long. I need to think about this, Josephine said, overwhelmed. Kyle nodded. Of course. I'll finish this step, then ride back to the Rocking P to explain things to my boss. I'll return tomorrow for your answer." True to his word, Kyle left by midday, but not before stacking firewood by the door and leaving her with some of his provisions. Alone again, Josephine paced the small cabin, weighing her options. She could try to make it to town, but with what prospects? Unmarried women in the territories had few respectable choices: schoolteacher if she had the education, which she didn't, servant, or wife. The alternative was unthinkable for a woman raised in a proper Boston family. Kyle's offer provided safety and security when she desperately needed both. But marriage to a man she'd just met. Her first marriage had been for love, or so she'd thought, and look how that had ended. Yet there was something about Kyle Prescott that inspired trust. His steady gaze, his capable hands, the way he spoke to her with respect rather than pity. He could have taken advantage of her desperate situation, but instead offered her protection on her terms. By the time she heard hoofbeats the next afternoon, Josephine had made her decision. She'd swept the cabin, washed her hair, and put on her one good dress, a faded blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. It wasn't vanity, she told herself, just proper respect for the gravity of the conversation ahead. Kyle arrived leading a second horse, a gentle-looking mare with a white blaze down her nose. He tied both animals to the porch rail and approached with his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Miller," he greeted her, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Prescott," she replied, finding it suddenly difficult to meet his eyes. "I've considered your offer." And Josephine took a deep breath. "I accept on one condition." Kyle raised an eyebrow. "Name it. If at any point either of us wishes to dissolve the arrangement, we do so with no ill will." Her chin lifted slightly. "I won't trap another man in a marriage he comes to regret." A smile touched the corners of Kyle's mouth. "Agreed, though I doubt I'll be the one with regrets, Mrs. Miller." "Josephine," she corrected. "If we're to be married, however temporarily, you should use my given name." "Josephine," he repeated, and something in the way he said it made her heart flutter unexpectedly. "And you must call me Kyle." She nodded, suddenly acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation alone together, discussing marriage like a business arrangement. "When would this take place?" "I spoke with the preacher in town. He can marry us tomorrow if you're willing." "Then we'd go directly to the land office to record our marriage and ensure your legal protection." "So soon?" Josephine felt a flutter of panic. Kyle's expression softened. "Fletcher could arrive any day. The sooner we establish your new status, the safer you'll be." She knew he was right. "Tomorrow, then," he gestured to the mare. "I brought you a horse. She's gentle but strong. Her name's Daisy." Josephine approached the animal cautiously. It had been weeks since Thomas had sold their horses and she'd missed the companionship. Daisy nuzzled her hand softly. "She's beautiful," Josephine whispered, tears pricking her eyes at this unexpected kindness. "She's yours," Kyle said simply. "Every woman needs her independence, even a married one." The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect September day in the Montana Territory. Josephine rose early, washing with precious stored rainwater and donning her blue dress again. She had few possessions to pack: some clothes, a locket containing a portrait of her parents, a well-worn Bible, and a few kitchen implements Thomas hadn't deemed valuable enough to take. Kyle arrived mid-morning, cleaner than she'd seen him before, his dark hair slicked back with water, his face freshly shaven. He wore a clean white shirt under his worn leather vest, and he'd polished his boots. "You look lovely," he said when he saw her, a hint of something deeper than politeness in his voice. "Thank you," she replied, feeling a blush warm her cheeks. "You're very kind to do this, Kyle." He helped her mount Daisy, and they set off for Silver Creek, the nearest town. They rode mostly in silence, each lost in thought about the enormous step they were about to take. Josephine couldn't help wondering if she was making another terrible mistake, but when she glanced at Kyle's strong profile against the blue Montana sky, she felt an unexpected sense of peace. Silver Creek was a typical frontier town: one main street with false-fronted buildings, a saloon, general store, blacksmith, and small white church at the far end. Curious eyes followed them as they rode down the center of town, Kyle nodding politely to those he knew. "News travels fast," he murmured. "Word of Thomas's departure has already reached town." Josephine kept her head high, ignoring the whispers. Let them talk. She had nothing to be ashamed of. The preacher, Reverend Adams, was waiting at the church, a kind-faced man in his 60s who took Josephine's hands in his and spoke gentle words of encouragement. To her surprise, the wife of Kyle's boss, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, was also present, a handsome woman in her 40s who embraced Josephine warmly. "I insisted on coming when Kyle told us what happened," she explained. "No bride should stand alone on her wedding day, even under such unusual circumstances." The ceremony itself was brief, but dignified. Kyle spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice, his eyes never leaving Josephine's face. When it came her turn, she was surprised to find her voice trembling with emotion, not love. Certainly not yet, but profound gratitude and a tentative hope for the future. When Reverend Adams pronounced them man and wife, Kyle hesitated only a moment before leaning forward to place the gentlest of kisses on her lips. It lasted barely a second, but Josephine felt it like a promise. Their next stop was the land office, where Kyle registered their marriage and filed paperwork adding Josephine's name to the deed of his homestead. The clerk, a balding man with spectacles, raised his eyebrows at the rapid sequence of events but made no comment as he stamped and filed the documents. "That's done," Kyle said as they emerged back onto the street. "You're legally Josephine Prescott now, with property rights that no one can challenge." It was strange to hear her new name spoken aloud, Josephine Prescott. She tested it silently, finding she didn't dislike the sound of it. "I should get some supplies while we're here," Kyle said, gesturing toward the general store. "Is there anything you need?" Josephine thought of the empty pantry, the worn clothing, all the necessities she lacked. "I have no money," she reminded him quietly. Kyle's expression softened. "You're my wife now, Josephine. What's mine is yours. That includes funds for household necessities." At the general store, Kyle encouraged her to select whatever she needed: flour, sugar, coffee, fabric for new clothes, seeds for a kitchen garden. Josephine chose carefully, mindful of expense despite his assurances. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Hobson, offered congratulations on their marriage with a knowing look that made Josephine blush. "Don't mind her," Kyle murmured as they left the store, their purchases loaded into saddlebags. "People will talk for a while, then find something new to gossip about." They stopped for a simple meal at the town's small restaurant before beginning the journey to their new home. No, Kyle's home, Josephine corrected herself mentally. She needed to remember this was a temporary arrangement, no matter how real it might appear to others. The ride to Kyle's homestead took nearly 3 hours. As they crested a small rise, he reined in his horse and pointed. "There it is." Josephine followed his gaze to a sheltered valley below. A sturdy log cabin stood near a creek lined with cottonwood trees, their leaves beginning to turn golden with autumn's approach. A small barn and corral stood nearby, and beyond them stretched open meadowland ringed by forest. "It's beautiful," she said honestly, taking in the peaceful scene. "It's not much," Kyle replied. "I built the cabin 5 years ago but haven't had much time to improve the place, being at the Rocking P most days." "You don't live here?" Josephine asked, surprised. "I stay at the bunkhouse on the ranch most nights. It's easier when I'm working dawn to dusk." He glanced at her. "But I'll stay here now, at least until you're settled. There's a lean-to off the back where I can sleep." "You'd sleep outside your own home," Josephine protested. "It's your home now too," Kyle reminded her. "And I meant what I said about respecting your boundaries." As they approached the cabin, Josephine could see it was simple but well built, with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. Inside was a single large room with a fireplace at one end, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a cupboard for supplies, and a curtained-off area that must contain the bed. Kyle busied himself bringing in their supplies and starting a fire while Josephine explored her new surroundings. The cabin was dusty from disuse, but solidly constructed. The bed behind the curtain was a proper one with a real mattress, not just a rope bed with a straw tick like she'd had with Thomas. "It needs a woman's touch," Kyle said apologetically as he watched her taking inventory. "I'm not much for decorating." "It's perfect," Josephine assured him, already planning how to make the space more comfortable. "I'll have it feeling like home in no time." Something flickered in Kyle's eyes at her words, pleasure, perhaps, or relief. "I should tend to the horses," he said, moving toward the door. "Take your time getting settled." Left alone, Josephine ran her fingers along the rough wooden walls, trying to absorb the reality of her situation. Yesterday, she'd been abandoned and facing destitution. Today, she was a newly married woman with a home and land. The speed of the change left her dizzy. By the time Kyle returned, she'd swept the floor, wiped down the surfaces, and was heating water for coffee on the freshly laid fire. "Something smells good," he said, removing his hat as he entered. "Just coffee," she replied. "Though I can make a proper meal once I've organized the supplies." They fell into an unexpectedly companionable routine that first evening. Kyle brought in more firewood and water from the creek, while Josephine prepared a simple supper of salt pork and beans. They ate together at the table, conversation flowing more easily than either expected as Kyle told her about the surrounding area, and Josephine shared stories of her childhood in Boston. As darkness fell, the inevitable awkwardness of their sleeping arrangements arose. True to his word, Kyle prepared to sleep in the lean-to despite Josephine's protests about the cooling autumn nights. "I'll be fine," he assured her. "I've slept under the stars in January blizzards. This is luxury by comparison." Josephine hesitated at the curtain to the bed area. "This doesn't seem right, you sleeping outside your own home." "It's the only proper arrangement for now," Kyle said firmly. "Good night, Josephine." "Good night, Kyle," she replied softly, disappearing behind the curtain. Sleep came surprisingly easily in the comfortable bed, lulled by the sound of the creek outside and the knowledge that, for the first time in days, she was safe. The next week established a pattern between them. Kyle worked around the homestead, repairing things that had long been neglected, while Josephine transformed the cabin into a home. She scoured every surface, hung the fabric she'd purchased as curtains, planted late-season vegetables in the kitchen garden, and organized their supplies with efficient precision. Kyle marveled at the changes. "I hardly recognize the place," he commented one evening as he returned from hunting to find fresh bread cooling on the table and wildflowers arranged in a tin can on the windowsill. Josephine smiled, pleased by his approval. "It just needed some attention." "Like most things worth having," he replied, their eyes meeting briefly before both looked away. On the 8th day, Kyle announced he needed to return to the Rocking P. "Mr. Patterson has been generous with my time away, but I have responsibilities there." Disappointment filled Josephine, though she knew it was foolish. Their arrangement had been clear from the beginning. "Of course, you must go." "I'll come back in a few days to check on you," he promised, "and I've repaired the rifle. It's loaded and over the door if you need it." After he left, the cabin seemed unnaturally quiet. Josephine threw herself into more projects, mending Kyle's shirts she'd found in a trunk, experimenting with wild berries she'd gathered to make preserves, even attempting to fashion a rug from scraps of fabric. True to his word, Kyle returned 3 days later with supplies from the ranch: fresh milk, eggs, and a side of venison. Josephine was embarrassed by how her heart leapt at the sound of his horse approaching. "The place looks even better," he said, glancing around at her improvements. "And something smells wonderful." "I found wild apples in that grove to the west," Josephine explained, gesturing to the pie cooling on the windowsill. "It's not much of a thank you for all you've done, but you don't need to thank me," Kyle interrupted gently. "This arrangement benefits me too. Look at what you've done with the place in just over a week." That night, after they'd shared the pie and Kyle had praised her cooking excessively, he again prepared to sleep in the lean-to. The nights are getting colder, Josephine protested. You can't keep sleeping outside. Kyle hesitated. What do you suggest? We could. Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks. We could share the bed, it's large enough, I trust you, Kyle. His expression softened. I appreciate that trust more than you know, but I gave my word this would be your choice in your time. I'm not suggesting anything improper, she clarified quickly. Just practical sleeping arrangements. We are married, after all, even if only on paper. After a long moment, Kyle nodded, if you're certain. That night, they lay side by side in the darkness, a respectful space between them, both acutely aware of the other's presence. Josephine could feel the warmth radiating from Kyle's body, hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was strange, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with physical contact, to share sleep with this man who was her husband but still largely a stranger. As September gave way to October, they settled into a new routine. Kyle divided his time between the rocking pea and the homestead, typically spending 4 days at the ranch and 3 with Josephine. During his absences, she kept busy improving their home and exploring the surrounding land. Daisy proved a faithful companion for rides along the creek and into the nearby woods. With each of Kyle's returns, their comfort with each other grew. They shared meals and conversation, worked side by side on projects around the property, and gradually, the initial awkwardness of sharing a bed faded. They maintained the careful space between them, but sometimes Josephine would wake in the night to find Kyle's hand had reached across that divide in sleep, resting near hers on the quilt between them. On a crisp October morning, Josephine was gathering the last of the season's herbs from her garden when she heard riders approaching. Her first thought was of Fletcher, finally arriving to claim the property Thomas had gambled away. She straightened, knife in hand, her heart pounding. But it was Kyle who appeared around the bend, accompanied by Mrs. Patterson from the rocking pea. Relief flooded through Josephine, followed quickly by concern at their serious expressions. "Is everything all right?" she asked as they dismounted. "Fletcher's in town," Kyle said without preamble. "He's been asking about Thomas Miller and his homestead." Josephine's hand flew to her throat. "Does he know where I am?" "Not yet," Mrs. Patterson replied, stepping forward to take Josephine's hands in hers. "But Silver Creek is a small town. It won't take him long to hear you've remarried and relocated." "What should we do?" Josephine looked to Kyle, finding strength in his steady gaze. "Nothing," he said firmly. "You're legally Josephine Prescott now with documented property rights to this homestead. Fletcher has no claim on you." "But he might come here," Josephine worried. "Thomas took his money, his property, let him come," Kyle's voice hardened. "You're under my protection now, no one will harm you or take what's yours." Mrs. Patterson squeezed Josephine's hands. "I came to warn you, dear, but also to invite you both to our harvest celebration at the ranch this weekend. It would do you good to be among friends right now." Josephine looked questioningly at Kyle, who nodded. "We'd be honored, Mrs. Patterson," after Mrs. Patterson departed. Josephine found herself unable to focus on her tasks, jumping at every sound from the woods. Kyle noticed her tension and suggested they ride the property boundaries together. "This land is protected by law and by my rifle," he assured her as they trotted side by side along the creek. "Fletcher is a gambler and a cheat, not a fighter. He won't risk confrontation." "I'm not afraid for myself," Josephine admitted. "I'm afraid he'll cause trouble for you." "You've done so much for me already," Kyle reined in his horse, turning to face her. "Josephine, I made a choice when I offered you marriage. I don't regret it." His voice softened. "In fact, these past weeks have been—" "What?" she prompted when he trailed off. A hint of color touched his cheeks. "They've been the happiest I can remember in a long time." Something warm unfurled in Josephine's chest at his words. "For me as well," she confessed quietly. Their eyes held for a moment longer than usual before Kyle cleared his throat and urged his horse forward again. But something had shifted between them. some unspoken acknowledgement that their arrangement had become more than a practical solution to a problem. The harvest celebration at the Rocking Pea Ranch was the largest social gathering Josephine had attended since coming west. The main house was filled with ranch hands, neighboring settlers, and townspeople, all enjoying Mrs. Patterson's generous hospitality. Tables groaned with food, a fiddle player provided music, and lanterns cast a golden glow over the festivities. Josephine felt self-conscious in her best dress, aware of curious glances and whispered comments about her whirlwind marriage to Kyle. But he stayed close by her side, his hand occasionally resting protectively at the small of her back, introducing her proudly as "my wife" to those who didn't know their story. "People are talking," she murmured as they helped themselves to Mrs. Patterson's famous apple cider. "Let them," Kyle replied easily. "We have nothing to hide, don't we?" Josephine gave him a pointed look. "Our marriage isn't exactly conventional." Kyle's expression grew serious. "What matters is what's between us, not what others think." Before she could ask what exactly he thought was between them, Mrs. Patterson appeared, drawing Josephine away to meet some of the other ranch wives. The women were kind, if curious, offering advice on surviving Montana winters and managing frontier households. "You've done wonders with Kyle's place," Mrs. Patterson told the group. "It's hardly recognizable. He's a changed man, too, smiling more, talking about something besides horses and cattle. We're still adjusting to married life," Josephine said carefully, aware of the knowing looks exchanged among the women. "It takes time," one of the older women assured her. "My Harold and I barely knew each other when we wed. Love grows with the sharing of days. Love." The word hung in Josephine's mind as she rejoined Kyle for the dancing that had begun in the cleared center of the room. Did she love him? Could she, after the betrayal of her first marriage? Yet as Kyle took her hand and led her into a simple waltz, she couldn't deny the quickening of her pulse at his touch, the way her body seemed to fit naturally against his as they moved to the music. This was different from what she'd felt for Thomas, less desperate, more grounded. Thomas had swept her off her feet with grand promises. Kyle had offered her safety, respect, and steady companionship. As the evening progressed, Josephine noticed a dark-haired stranger watching them from the corner, his expression calculating. A shiver of unease ran through her. "Kyle," she whispered, "who is that man by the door?" Kyle followed her gaze, his arm tightening around her waist. "That's Fletcher," he confirmed grimly. "Stay close to me." They continued dancing, but the joy had leached from the evening. When the song ended, Kyle guided her toward Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, positioning himself between Josephine and Fletcher's watchful gaze. "He's here," Kyle said quietly to Mr. Patterson, who nodded gravely. "I see him. Don't worry, we won't let him cause trouble at our celebration." But as the evening was winding down and guests began to depart, Fletcher approached them in the yard as Kyle was preparing their horses. "So you're Miller's wife," Fletcher drawled, blocking their path. "Or should I say his former wife?" Josephine lifted her chin. "I'm Mrs. Prescott now." Fletcher's eyes narrowed. Mighty convenient, that quick remarriage, almost as if someone was trying to avoid paying debts. Kyle stepped forward. "My wife owes you nothing, Fletcher. Whatever arrangement you had with Thomas Miller died when he abandoned his responsibilities and fled the territory. I have a signed deed to property that wasn't legally his to gamble away," Kyle interrupted. "His wife had rights too, rights you conveniently ignored." Fletcher's hand drifted toward his hip where a pistol rested. "I don't take kindly to being cheated." "Nor do I take kindly to men threatening my wife," Kyle replied, his voice dangerously soft. "Walk away, Fletcher. Whatever Miller owed you, it's not worth dying over." The tension stretched between them until Mr. Patterson and several ranch hands appeared behind Kyle. Outnumbered, Fletcher spat on the ground near Josephine's feet. "This isn't over," he snarled before stalking away. The ride home was silent, both lost in thought about Fletcher's threat. When they reached the homestead, Kyle checked and double-checked the cabin's security before finally allowing himself to relax. "He won't try anything tonight," he assured Josephine. "But I don't like leaving you alone here now that he knows where you are. What choice do we have?" Josephine asked. "You can't abandon your work at the Rocking P." Kyle ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I've been thinking about that. Mr. Patterson offered me a new position today managing the eastern section of the ranch, which borders our property. It would mean living here full-time. You do that." Josephine searched his face in the lamplight. "Change your entire work arrangement, I would," he said simply. "For you." Something shifted between them in that moment, the acknowledgement that what had begun as a practical arrangement had become something neither had anticipated. Josephine reached for his hand hesitantly. "Kyle, when we married, you said it would be my choice if things ever changed between us." His fingers tightened around hers. "I meant it. What if?" She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "What if I'm beginning to want something more?" The look that crossed Kyle's face, hope mingled with disbelief, made her heart ache. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough. "After everything with Thomas, I wouldn't blame you for never trusting a man again." "You're nothing like Thomas," Josephine said firmly. "You've shown me what a real man is: honorable, dependable, kind." She stepped closer. "I think I could love you, Kyle Prescott. I think perhaps I already do." Kyle's breath caught. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his hand to cup her cheek. "I've been falling in love with you since the day I found you on that porch," he confessed. "But I was afraid to hope you might ever feel the same." When his lips met hers, it was nothing like the brief, ceremonial kiss at their wedding. This was a beginning, not an obligation tender at first, then deepening as Josephine's arms wound around his neck. Kyle held her as if she were precious, his restraint evident even as the kiss conveyed months of unspoken longing. When they finally parted, breathless, Josephine rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the rapid beating of his heart. "Stay," she whispered. "Not in the lean-to, not with that space between us in bed. Stay with me as my husband in truth." Kyle tilted her face up to his eyes searching hers. "You're sure?" In answer, Josephine took his hand and led him toward the curtained bed area, her heart pounding but her mind certain. This was right. This was her choice. The next morning, Josephine woke to find Kyle's arm draped protectively around her waist, his breath warm against her neck. For the first time since Thomas's betrayal, she felt completely safe, completely at peace. Kyle stirred, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "Good morning, Mrs. Prescott." She turned in his arms, smiling at the tenderness in his eyes. "Good morning, husband." They spent the day in a bubble of newfound intimacy, reluctant to be apart even for mundane tasks. Kyle spoke more about his past growing up on a small farm in Missouri, losing his parents to cholera, working cattle drives across the plains, before finding a home with the Pattersons at the Rocking P. Josephine shared her own story, her sheltered upbringing in Boston, meeting Thomas at a church social after her parents died, being swept away by his promises of adventure in the West. "I was so naive," she admitted as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the valley gold. "I thought love was grand gestures and excitement. I never understood it could be this quiet moments, shared work, feeling safe." Kyle's arm tightened around her shoulders. "That's real love, the kind that builds something lasting." The peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. 2 days later, as Kyle was repairing a section of corral fence, a rider approached from the direction of town. Josephine, hanging laundry nearby, recognized the town's deputy sheriff and felt a cold knot of dread form in her stomach. "Mr. Prescott," the deputy called, touching the brim of his hat. "Mrs. Prescott, sorry to intrude." Kyle set down his tools, moving to stand beside Josephine. "What brings you out this way, Deputy Willis?" "There was trouble in town last night. That gambler, Fletcher, got drunk at the saloon, started making accusations about you too." The deputy looked uncomfortable. "He claims your marriage is a fraud designed to cheat him out of property rightfully his." "That's absurd," Josephine protested. "I know, madam," Willis assured her, but he's filed a formal complaint with the sheriff. He's demanding an investigation into the legality of your marriage and property claims. Kyle's jaw tightened. Our marriage is legal and properly recorded, so are our property deeds. The sheriff knows that, Willis agreed. But Fletcher's hired a lawyer from Helena who's making noise about fraud and conspiracy. He hesitated. There's more. Fletcher's claiming he has a witness who can testify that Thomas Miller told him the marriage was never legally binding in the first place. Josephine gasped. What? Someone named Billings, a widow from over near Fort Benton. The woman Thomas had mentioned, the one warming his bed while still married to Josephine. Nausea rose in her throat. This is harassment, Kyle said firmly, based on the word of a known cheat and an inappropriate acquaintance of Thomas Miller. I agree, the deputy nodded. But the sheriff asked me to let you know there'll likely be a hearing before the circuit judge when he comes through next month. You should prepare. After the deputy left, Josephine sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly weak. What if they invalidate our marriage? What if they believe Thomas never legally married me in the first place? Kyle knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. Listen to me. I won't let anyone take you or this place from me. If we have to marry again in front of the judge himself, we will. But if Thomas and I were never legally married, then everything he did selling the homestead, gambling away the property, none of it was legal either, Josephine realized. Which means Fletcher's claim is even more questionable, Kyle agreed. He may have just undermined his own case. The month leading up to the judge's arrival was tense. Josephine threw herself into winterizing their home, preserving food, mending clothes, preparing for the harsh Montana winter ahead. Kyle divided his time between his new duties for the Rocking P and strengthening their legal position, making trips to Silver Creek to consult with the town's only lawyer. Their evenings were a sanctuary from the stress, hours spent planning their future together as if the threat didn't exist. Kyle spoke of expanding the homestead, building additional rooms onto the cabin, perhaps even starting a small horse breeding operation. Josephine shared her dreams of a proper garden, chickens, maybe even children someday. It was during one such evening, as they sat before the fire discussing spring planting, that Josephine realized how completely her heart had transformed. What had begun as a marriage of convenience, a desperate solution to an impossible situation, had become the most authentic relationship of her life. I love you, she said suddenly, interrupting Kyle's thoughts about crop rotation. He blinked, then broke into a smile that warmed her to her toes. I was just thinking how much I love hearing you plan our future, as if there's no doubt in your mind we'll have one. There isn't, she said firmly. No matter what happens at that hearing, I am your wife in every way that matters. No judge or law can change that. The circuit judge arrived in Silver Creek on a blustery November day. Judge Harlan McIntosh was a stern-faced man with a reputation for fairness, which gave Josephine hope as they entered the makeshift courtroom set up in the town hall. Fletcher sat on one side with his lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. To Josephine's horror, a woman she didn't recognize but assumed must be the widow Billings sat beside them, her expression coldly calculating. Kyle and Josephine were represented by Mr. Abernathy, Silver Creek's aging lawyer. They'd been joined by Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, Reverend Adams, and several townspeople who'd come to support them. The proceedings were formal but straightforward. Fletcher's lawyer presented his case first, arguing that Thomas Miller had never legally married Josephine, making all subsequent property transactions questionable. He called the widow Billings, who testified that Thomas had told her his Boston marriage was never properly recorded. When it was their turn, Mr. Abernathy methodically dismantled the opposition's arguments. He presented the original marriage certificate from Boston, which Josephine had fortunately kept among her few possessions. He called Reverend Adams to testify about performing Kyle and Josephine's wedding, and the clerk from the land office to confirm the proper filing of all documents. Finally, he called Josephine herself. As she took the oath, she felt Kyle's encouraging gaze on her. "Mrs. Prescott," Abernathy began, "could you tell the court how you came to Montana Territory?" Josephine recounted her story: her parents' deaths, her marriage to Thomas in Boston before a proper minister with witnesses, their journey west, and the homestead they'd built together. "And when did you learn your husband had abandoned you?" "September 14th of this year," Josephine replied, her voice steady. "He told me he had gambled away our property to Mr. Fletcher and was leaving for the Dakota Territory. He took all our money, our horses, and most of our valuables." "How did you meet Mr. Prescott?" "He came to collect a debt Thomas owed to his employer. When he found me alone and abandoned, he offered help." "And his proposal of marriage, what was its nature?" Josephine hesitated, aware that the truth might sound calculating. But she'd sworn to tell the truth. "It was initially a practical arrangement. He offered me his name and property for legal protection, expecting nothing in return." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Josephine continued, her gaze finding Kyle's, but what began as practical has become. Her voice softened. "The greatest blessing of my life." Fletcher's lawyer cross-examined her harshly, trying to trap her in inconsistencies, but Josephine's straightforward answers left him frustrated. When Kyle took the stand, his testimony matched hers exactly. Yes, their marriage had begun as a practical solution. Yes, he had known her only briefly before proposing. No, he had never met Thomas Miller or had any prior dealings with Fletcher. "Mr. Prescott," the judge interjected, "why would you marry a woman you barely knew and give her claim to your property?" Kyle's answer was simple. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because from the moment I met her, I knew Josephine was a woman worth protecting." The judge considered this, then asked, "And now, is this still merely a practical arrangement?" Kyle's gaze found Josephine's across the courtroom. "No, Your Honor, now it's a real marriage in every sense. I love my wife and intend to spend the rest of my life with her." Judge McIntosh needed only an hour to reach his decision. The courtroom fell silent as he delivered his ruling. The court finds the marriage between Josephine and Thomas Miller was legal and binding until the day of her marriage to Kyle Prescott. As such, any property transactions conducted by Thomas Miller without his wife's consent were legally questionable at best. Fletcher's face darkened as the judge continued. "Furthermore, the marriage between Kyle and Josephine Prescott is valid and properly recorded. Their property rights are clear and uncontestable." He fixed Fletcher with a stern glare. "This court dismisses all claims against the Prescotts and warns Mr. Fletcher that any further harassment could result in legal consequences." Relief flooded through Josephine as Kyle crossed the room to embrace her. It was over. They were safe. Fletcher stormed from the courtroom, his lawyer hurrying after him. The widow Billings gave Josephine a look of pure venom before following. "Do you think he'll cause more trouble?" Josephine whispered to Kyle as they accepted congratulations from their supporters. "He might try," Kyle replied, "but he'd be a fool." The whole town witnessed the judge's warning. That night, safely back at their homestead, Josephine and Kyle celebrated their victory with a special dinner, and the bottle of wine Mrs. Patterson had pressed upon them. As they sat before the fire, Josephine nestled against Kyle's chest. She reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. "6 months ago, I thought my life was over," she murmured. "Now I can't imagine a life without you." Kyle pressed a kiss to her hair. "When I rode up to your homestead that day, I was just doing my job. I never expected to find the other half of my soul." "Do you ever regret it, marrying a desperate woman you barely knew?" "Never," Kyle said firmly. "Even if you'd never grown to love me, giving you safety and a home would have been enough." Josephine turned in his arms to face him. "I have something to tell you," she said softly. "I've suspected for a few weeks, but with the hearing, I didn't want to add to our worries." Kyle's brow furrowed. "What is it?" Taking his hand, Josephine placed it gently on her stomach. "Come spring, our family will be growing by one." Kyle's expression transformed from confusion to wonder. "A baby, you're certain?" Josephine nodded, tears of happiness filling her eyes. "Our child, a new beginning." The joy that flooded Kyle's face was everything Josephine had hoped for. He gathered her into his arms, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "Both of you." As the first snow of winter began to fall outside their window, Josephine Prescott counted her blessings. A husband who loved her, a home that was truly hers, a child growing beneath her heart. All because one man had seen a desperate woman on a porch and offered not just his name, but eventually his heart. Thomas Miller had left her with nothing, but Kyle Prescott had given her everything: his name, his house, and a love she'd never dared to dream possible. Spring came to Montana in a rush of melting snow and new growth. The creek behind the Prescott homestead swelled with runoff from the mountains. Wildflowers dotted the meadows, and inside the expanded cabin, a new life entered the world with a lusty cry. "She's perfect," Kyle whispered, cradling his newborn daughter with awe as Josephine rested after a long but ultimately successful labor. Mrs. Patterson, who had come to assist as midwife, busied herself with cleaning up, giving the new family a moment of privacy. "Elizabeth," Josephine said softly. "After my mother, Elizabeth Prescott," Kyle agreed, "the newest owner of this land." Josephine smiled, exhausted but radiantly happy. "She'll grow up knowing only love and security, not abandonment." Kyle placed their daughter in her arms, then sat beside them on the bed, his arm protectively encircling his family. "I'll make sure of it," he promised. As Elizabeth's tiny hand curled around her father's finger, Josephine thought of how close she had come to losing everything. Instead, through the darkest moment of her life, she had found the brightest future she could imagine. "Thank you," she whispered to Kyle. "For what?" "For riding up to my homestead that day, for offering me a chance when I had none, for loving me." Kyle pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "No, Josephine, thank you for making this house a home." Outside, the Montana spring continued its miracle of renewal. Inside, a family that had begun as a practical arrangement celebrated the most profound miracle of all: love that had grown from the ashes of betrayal into something enduring and true. Over the next 5 years, the Prescott homestead flourished. Kyle's careful management and Josephine's tireless work transformed the original 30 acres into a prosperous small ranch. They added rooms to the cabin. As their family grew, Elizabeth was joined by brothers James and Daniel, filling the once quiet home with laughter and childish adventures. Fletcher never returned to cause trouble. Rumor had it he'd moved on to Wyoming after losing heavily in a poker game in Helena. Thomas Miller's name occasionally surfaced in stories of the Dakota gold fields, usually in connection with some scheme or swindle, but he never returned to Montana. On the 5th anniversary of their marriage, Kyle surprised Josephine with a proper gold wedding band to replace the simple band he'd hastily purchased for their wedding. "I made a promise that day," he reminded her as he slipped the new ring onto her finger. "That our marriage would be your choice for as long as you wanted it." "Forever," Josephine said without hesitation. "That's how long I choose." As they stood together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard that had once seemed so empty and hopeless to Josephine, she reflected on the strange turns of fate that had brought her to this moment. Thomas Miller had indeed left her with nothing. But Kyle Prescott had given her not just his name and his house, he had given her a love story more beautiful than any she could have imagined. And in the end, that was everything.